Hello everyone, welcome back to Mediverse, and in this video we'll be discussing the regulation of blood pressure. So how is the blood pressure regulated? What do you mean by regulation? So if the individual is having high or low BP, okay, for a constant time, for example, if the person is suffering from high BP, then after some time when the BP is measured, the BP was normal, okay. Or if the individual was suffering from a decreased BP, and after some time when again the BP was measured, the blood pressure was normal, in the normal range. So how does this occur? How does this change occur? What is the mechanism behind the normal, again the regulation of BP back to normal? So how does this occur? This is by the regulation of BP. This is we'll discuss in the regulation. There is short term regulation as well as the long term regulation. So we'll be discussing each type of regulation in detail. So in short term regulation, again we are having the baroreceptor mechanism, chemoreceptor mechanism, and CNS ischemic response. Whereas in the long term regulation we are having the renal mechanism. So let us discuss each heading in detail. Okay, so first we'll go with the baroreceptor mechanism. So what exactly is baroreceptor mechanism? So it is a short term regulation type of BP, and in this what happens is, so it is responsible for both regulating the increased or decreased BP. Okay, so once if the BP is increased, what will happen? So as the BP is increased, it will activate the baroreceptors. So what are the baroreceptors? So these baroreceptors are present in the aortic arch and the carotid sinus. Okay, so what is aortic arch? So if this is the arch of aorta, so these are the baroreceptors that are present in the aortic arch. Okay, so this is the baroreceptors. Okay, and what is carotid sinus? So this is where the carotid sinus is present. Okay, if this is the internal carotid and if this is the external carotid artery, and at the bifurcation of internal and the external carotid artery we get to see the carotid sinus. Okay, so these are the basics. Okay, this will get to see in the anatomy also. So here are the regions where these receptors are located. So these baroreceptors are the specialized receptors that are responsible to detect the change in the blood pressure. Okay, so once there is increase or decrease in the BP, then they detect the change in the BP. Because of the change in the BP, they get activated. Okay, once they get activated, they send sensory impulses to the nucleus of tractus solitrus. Okay, this is the name of the nucleus, that is tractus solitrus. Okay, this is the nucleus where these sensory impulses are sent via 9th and 10th cranial nerves. Okay, via the 9th and 10th cranial nerves, these baroreceptors, they send sensory impulses to the nucleus of tractus solitrus. So this nucleus is present in the medulla oblongata, in the dorsomedial part of the medulla oblongata. This nucleus is present. Okay, now once the nucleus receives this sensory information, what does it do? That is what we need to understand. So before that, we need to remember one point, that sympathetic activity. Okay, sympathetic activity increases BP. Okay, vice versa, parasympathetic activity decreases BP. Okay, these two terms you need to remember in order to understand the further concept. Okay, now what does this nucleus solitrus do? Remember that VMC, that is these two are the types of centers. Okay, VMC is nothing but vasomotor center, and this is responsible for increasing the sympathetic activity. Okay, this is responsible for increasing the sympathetic activity. Whereas the cardiovagal center, this is responsible for increasing the parasympathetic activity. Okay, VMC, it is responsible for increasing the sympathetic activity, whereas the CVC, that is the cardiovagal center, is responsible for increasing the parasympathetic activity. Now, if the sympathetic activity increases, BP will increase. If the parasympathetic activity increases, BP will decrease. Now, as the BP is already increased, this nucleus, what does it do? It will try to manage the BP by decreasing the BP. That means, how will it decrease the BP? By stimulating the CVC. Okay, because the BP is increased, it will try to control the increased BP by decreasing the BP. It will try to bring the BP back to the normal rate. Okay, by stimulating the CVC center. Okay, these two centers, they are controlled by this nucleus. Okay, so because the BP is increased, it will stimulate the CVC and it will inhibit the VMC. Okay, so by stimulation of the CVC, it will cause increase in parasympathetic discharge, that is the parasympathetic activity there. How will it increase the parasympathetic discharge? By bradycardia, that is decreased heart rate. So if the heart rate is less, there is decreased cardiac output. If the cardiac output is less, there is decreased BP. This is how this nucleus tractus solitarius, it will regulate the BP, and not only by stimulation of CVC but also by the inhibition of VMC, that is the vasomotor center. It will inhibit the sympathetic discharge. So if the sympathetic discharge is inhibited, what will happen? There is dilatation of blood vessels. So sympathetic discharge, what will it do? It will cause vasoconstriction. So there is no vasoconstriction, so it will inhibit the vasoconstriction. That is why there is dilatation of the blood vessels, and because of that there is further decrease in BP. Okay, there is further decrease in BP, and ultimately by these two centers there is regulation of BP. By decreasing the BP, they will regulate the BP. Okay, this is about the baroreceptor mechanism. So if suppose if the BP is decreased, what will happen? Up to here the process will be same, but here when the BP is decreased, it will stimulate the VMC and it will inhibit the CVC. Okay, by this the BP in this way the BP will be regulated. So this is all about the baroreceptor mechanism. So these baroreceptors, they act as sensors, whereas the nucleus tractus solitarius, it acts as center. Okay, and this centers like VMC and CVC, they act as effector. Okay, these three names, I think you all are familiar in the general physiology, in the feedback inhibition. Okay, in the negative feedback mechanism, we get to see this example, okay, of regulation of BP. Now the second type of regulation is by chemoreceptor mechanism. So these chemoreceptors are again another type of receptors that get activated whenever there is change in the chemistry of the blood. So whenever the components of the blood are changed, then it will detect the change in the chemistry and then it will get activated. Okay, that is how the chemoreceptors work. Okay, what are the types of chemoreceptors? Peripheral chemoreceptors and medullary chemoreceptors. What is the location of peripheral chemoreceptors? Carotid bodies and aortic bodies. Okay, carotid bodies, the information from the carotid bodies is carried out by 9th cranial nerve, and information from the aortic bodies is carried out by 10th cranial nerve. Okay, whereas so these peripheral chemoreceptors, they are present, they are they are stimulated by hypoxia, that is decreased oxygen content in the atmosphere, and asphyxia, that is increased CO2. Okay, asphyxia. So what is asphyxia? It is hypoxia plus hypercapnia. What is hypercapnia? Increased CO2 content in the blood. Okay, so asphyxia, in these two conditions, these peripheral chemoreceptors get activated. So when do the medullary chemoreceptors get activated? So where are they present? It is present in the central ventral surface of the medulla. Okay, near the respiratory center. So they are stimulated by the change in the H plus concentration. Okay, this is how this get activated, and these are the places where they are present. Okay, medullary chemoreceptors and peripheral chemoreceptors. Now let us understand the mechanism of regulation. Now, as I've already said, that these are sensitive to the change in the chemistry of the blood. So what do you mean by the change in chemistry? So whenever the blood flow to the chemoreceptors decreases, so whenever there is decreased BP, decreased blood pressure, then there is decreased blood flow to the chemoreceptors. So these peripheral and the central chemoreceptors, whenever they receive the low blood, then what will happen? So in that blood there is decreased oxygen, increased CO2 and increased H plus concentration. Yes, automatically whenever the blood flow to the this receptors is less, at that time there is less oxygen, increased CO2 and increased H plus concentration. This is the point where there is change in the chemistry of the blood, and that is when there is the chemoreceptors get activated. Okay, this activated chemoreceptors, what is the role of these activated chemoreceptors? What do? They send impulses to the vasoconstriction center. Okay, they send impulses to the vasoconstriction center, and this vasoconstriction center, what will it do? In the name itself it suggests that it will cause vasoconstriction. By vasoconstriction, what will happen? The BP will increase. So this is the mechanism by which it will increase the BP from low BP, and this is how the BP will come back to normal. So this is how the mechanism of regulation of BP occurs by chemoreceptors. Now the third type of regulation, short-term regulation, is CNS ischemic response. So what do you mean by CNS ischemic response? So the thing is, it is the regulation of the BP by the central nervous system. How does it occur? So whenever there is decreased BP, that means there is decreased blood flow to the central nervous system, that is the brain and the spinal cord. There is CNS ischemia. What do you mean by CNS ischemia? Ischemia means there is decreased blood flow, that means there is decreased oxygen content in the blood. That will lead to ischemia. There is decreased blood supply to the central nervous system because of decreased blood flow. Because of this, the CO2 which is there in the blood, in the deoxygenated blood, that will accumulate in the VMC. What is VMC? Vasomotor center. Now because of that, this vasomotor center, what it does, it cannot do its role. Its function is to increase the sympathetic activity, but it cannot do that. Why? Because already there is the CO2 is getting accumulated in the VMC. So instead of doing its activity, it stimulates the pressure area. Okay, remember, it stimulates the pressure area. This pressure area, what will it do is called it causes the powerful sympathetic discharge. Because the VMC itself cannot do this, it will stimulate the pressure area, and further the pressure area will cause the powerful sympathetic discharge. Okay, this is how the heart rate and the BP increases, and this is how the regulation of BP occurs. So by the decreased BP is again comes back to normal by the pressure area which is stimulated by VMC, and VMC cannot do its role because of CO2 getting accumulated in VMC. Okay, this is how the CNS ischemic response comes to action. Now let us discuss the last and the most important regulation, that is the long-term regulation of BP. Okay, and the long-term regulation of BP, it occurs by renal mechanism. Okay, by the kidneys. In the kidneys, the long-term regulation occurs. So there are two methods of long-term regulation of BP. One is the direct method and another one is indirect method. First, let us discuss the direct method. In the direct method, there is the name of the mechanism is the renal fluid mechanism. So whenever there is decreased blood flow, to the kidneys, there is low blood pressure in the kidneys. Okay, that will lead to renal ischemia. There is decreased blood flow to the kidneys. So because of that, whenever there is decreased blood flow, the GFR that comes is also less. Okay, so there is low GFR. So if there is less GFR, it will compensate this decreased blood flow by water and electrolyte retention. So it will prevent the water loss and the electrolyte loss through the urine. Okay, so this water and electrolyte retention, how does this occur? There is indirect mechanism that comes into action. Okay, the indirect mechanism comes to action, and this will cause water and electrolyte retention. So whenever there is water and electrolyte retention, that will lead to increase in ECF extracellular fluid. Okay, ECF volume increases. Why it increases? Because there is more water and electrolyte preserved. Okay, there is more water and electrolyte conserved, and because of that there is increase in ECF volume. So as the ECF increases, the blood volume also increases. Blood volume as it increases, the arterial pressure increases. The arterial pressure as it increases, cardiac output increases. If the cardiac output increases, ultimately the BP will increase. and this is how the decreased BP is again coming back to normal through the renal fluid mechanism. Okay, this is the direct method. Now what is the indirect method? So in the indirect method, there is two other mechanisms that come into the role. One is the aldosterone system and the second one is renin angiotensin system. Okay, so whenever there is low BP, this is indirect way, that's why this is connected to direct also. So whenever there is low BP, there is tissue perfusion. That means there is decreased blood supply to the tissues. Okay, because of decreased blood supply to the tissues, ultimately it also leads to renal ischemia. That is decreased blood supply to the entire kidney. Now, because of that, what will happen? The tissue perfusion will lead to stimulation of adrenal cortex. So the adrenal cortex is getting stimulated. So adrenal cortex is present in the adrenal glands. Okay, that will cause the release of aldosterone. This is very important. This aldosterone, what will it do is it will cause water and electrolyte retention. So this is how the water and electrolyte retention occurs. Okay, this is about the aldosterone system. So the aldosterone is released whenever there is tissue perfusion, and ultimately that will lead to water and electrolyte retention, and ultimately it will lead to increase in BP. Now, what is the renin angiotensin system? So, because of tissue perfusion, there is renal ischemia that occurs, and in renal ischemia, what happens is there is stimulation of JG apparatus. Okay, whenever there is renal ischemia, there is decreased blood flow to the kidneys. The JG apparatus gets stimulated. This JG apparatus, from this JG apparatus, renin is released. Okay, this renin, it acts on angiotensinogen, and it converts the angiotensinogen to active angiotensin 1. Again, this angiotensin 1 is converted to angiotensin 2. Okay, because it is more powerful vasoconstrictor. So this angiotensin is a powerful vasoconstrictor, and among all this, angiotensin 2 is the most powerful vasoconstrictor. Okay, so this angiotensin 2, what it does is it causes the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex by the stimulation of adrenal cortex. Okay, that is one role, that is one indirect effect. Then what is the another effect is it shows direct effect on water and electrolyte retention. It will directly promote the water and electrolyte retention, thereby increasing the BP. And because it is a powerful vasoconstrictor, it directly acts on blood vessels, and it will cause vasoconstriction, and thereby it increases the BP. So this angiotensin 2, it plays a very important role because it is acting on three processes, three mechanisms. It is acting on adrenal cortex, it is acting on water and electrolytes, and it is also acting on blood vessels, thereby increasing the BP. So this long-term regulation of BP comes to action whenever there is decreased BP. It will increase the BP by these three methods, direct and indirect methods. Okay, I hope this is clear, and thank you.